Staying with news of the courts, murder-accused Nthuthuko Shoba's defence contradicted his own version of events. In closing arguments of his trial, his defence told the Johannesburg High Court there was no evidence leading Shoba to the murder of Tshegofatso Pule. Pule was allegedly murdered in a contract killing orchestrated by Shoba. His defence argued that the state has not shown any proof that Shoba was in control of a disputed phone number. It's alleged this number tried to lure Pule to a bogus interview. Shoba's lawyers say from state evidence the message that was not from the disputed number. However, when Shoba took to the stand last week, he explained that he had contacted the number from his landline after Pule told him about an interview. Let's cross live to those proceedings then and listen into what's taking place in court.
Is that Mr. Malepane is capable of saying anything to save his back, including even trying to cover up for somebody else.
But isn't that then what your case boils down to? That I must reject everything Mr. Malepane says?
As it may please the court.
There's no sorting the wheat from the chaff. Everything Mr. Malepane says is untrustworthy, unreliable, probably untrue, and that's the end of it.
And it is not for His Lordship to do picture-sharing exercise in order to try and find credibility. It is uncalled for, given the opportunity that everyone involved in the investigation of the matter would have simply minimized or even made unnecessary. A simple task, because the basis of this case, amongst others, despite the scenario that His Lordship is referring to, is the whereabouts and or ownership of the disputed phone. It would have been even easier to know if whoever was contacted that would have been to verify and implicated the accused. It would have made a job. You wouldn't even have been busy with the exercise that we are minded. That is what I could submit.
See, I have some difficulty with that submission. The cases that Mr. Mohammed relies on, and certainly my understanding of the criminal law, is that if a witness tells a story, and the story is true in parts, and the story could be true in parts and true in and untrue in other parts, and that when you have a witness that lies some of the time and tells the truth, possibly tells the truth at other times, one must evaluate the evidence carefully, with circumspection, seek corroboration, but one doesn't seize on a lie that the witness tells and automatically reject the rest of that witness's testimony. So what I call sorting the wheat from the chaff and you call cherry picking is really an exercise that the court is required to do. It's required to separate out Mr. Malepane's, analyse Mr. Malepane's testimony as a whole, and to consider, first of all, whether it is so tainted that it has to be rejected in its entirety. But if it is not so tainted that it has to be rejected in its entirety, decide which parts of it can safely be accepted and which parts of it have to be rejected. And I'm trying to work out where you are planting your flag, Mr. Makabela. It seems to me that you're planting your flag on the first point, that there is just nothing from Mr. Malepane's evidence that can be accepted. Is that so?
I'm also saying, in addition to that, that even if the court would be inclined to want to find any credibility on some aspects of this case, there are inherent risks involved to even attempt to do that, given the intensity of his obsession towards having the accused dealt with in this regard, because he believes the accused sold him out, and which...
Well, now you're relying on bias. So if there's an inherent bias, if a witness has an inherent bias towards the accused, that's certainly a reason not to accept their evidence.
It's
Where
one
does that
of,
bias come from, though?
is the one of the aspects and factors that the Honorable Court ought to take into account. And our submission is that the cumulative effect of all these red flags are such that venturing into an exercise of even attempting to accept or try to find credibility on some of the aspects that seems to implicate the accused where the accused denies it, it's a precarious exercise.
Well, can we isolate the bias point? We whole string of cases that say if a witness is determined from the outset to inculpate the accused, has a reason to do so arising from their prior relationship, then you treat that witness's evidence with a great deal of circumspection, and it might well be that you reject it in its entirety. Where do I find that kind of bias in this case?
In the entirety of his conduct from the onset, that he is hell-bent from the onset, from which he recants and still proceeds to want to implicate the accused based on a fictitious contract to kill, which when one gives a further probe into it, seems to have a lot of potholes with respect. For instance,
yes, but why is he making up the contract?
in order to validate his story, as they say, as I earlier submitted with respect, my lord, but that Mr. Malepane seems to be a great scriptwriter, and he needed to find some punchline.
I mean, your case may well be that Mr. Malapani is a fantasist, but that's different from saying he's biased against Mr. Shoba.
But
so why does he have an axe to grind against Mr. Shoba, and what is that axe?
well, he would know better than we can. We don't, as I earlier also submitted, that there seems to be more than has been revealed to the court, and I cannot take it beyond what I have submitted in regard that his conduct is laden with some kind of obsession towards really having the accused being dealt with and blamed for the killing of Ms. Pule.
You can't take it any further than a sort of motiveless malignancy.
He's trying to find a motive also by saying that there was this 8 million booty available, and from which there is also this far-fetched suggestion that would have been the fact that Ms. Pule insisted on a termination of pregnancy. And the...
Well, no, I'm talking about Mr. Malapani's reasons for inculpating Mr. Shoba. You're suggesting to me that one of the reasons I should reject his evidence is because he's biased against Mr. Shoba. What I'm asking you is, where are the facts from which I draw that inference?
It's self-serving. A conduct on him that displays and an inference that can be drawn that he is partisan. He doesn't concede and doesn't give it. He gives it an all about imputing blame and putting blame at every given opportunity against the accused, despite the characters changing of what role to play. And that, with respect to me, can be inferred as some kind of having adopted a side, and the side of guilty. Of course, when witnesses take a stand, they do adopt a side of having to account, but not to the extent of coming across as malicious and even going on social media and saying that I will arrange that this person be dealt with in prison by being gang raped. It doesn't go around.
You're talking about voice notes.
Indeed, my lord.
So, as far as you can take the bias point is, he doesn't want to be in this on his own, and he's looking for somebody to drag down with him, and it just so happens to be Mr. Shaw.
Indeed, my lord.
And that's what I'm left.
Thanks, my lord.
Thank you.
And I have extensively dealt with issues on my head I don't believe, unless if His Lordship wants to direct me to any. I have also cited authority regarding our stance with regard to whether the state has proven its case, a case beyond reasonable doubt. And also, my learned friend in his heads of argument referred to screenshots that would be indicative of the fact that the issue of termination of pregnancy would have been a motive. At paragraph 11.5 and refers to Exhibit D, where a claim is made that she expresses a stance against abortion. Our response to that, it is a stance that she expresses, but it is not a stance reflective of the accused attitude at the time. In fact, if anything, the WhatsApp tends to display that the accused had embraced the fact that the deceased was pregnant, and then subsequent to that, there were ups and downs, supportive though as it were, and a commitment to assist her during the pregnancy. And we also highlight in our heads also that the issue of not having the two families meet to discuss the issue of pregnancy, the accused dealt with it adequately. I don't think there would be any need of me to raise, unless if there are specific aspects as to the motive.
How far had the pregnancy advanced when Ms. Pule told Mr. Shoba that she was pregnant?
It was only 3 months.
3 months.
Yes. And even their WhatsApp suggests that, listen, Nana, we shouldn't be in a rush. We still don't know what we're dealing with. Let's wait and find out how far we are and so forth. And even the issue of termination does not arise from conversation by Mr. Shoba. It is something that she says based on their joint previous experience about pregnancy. And there is no way where it seems the accused suggested or seemed to have been peeved about it to the extent that we would have wanted her at least dead.
Well, I mean, Ms. Pule sends a number of messages that suggest that she believes that Mr. Shoba is fobbing her off. I think that's about as far as it goes, isn't it?
I didn't hear the word, Madam.
Ms. Pule sends a number of messages that give me the very strong impression that she believed that Mr. Shoba was trying to fob her off, not being responsive, not showing the level of involvement that she felt was necessary.
Indeed, that might be so,
Yeah.
but those were her expectations.
Yeah.
The level of expectations cannot be expected to be the same and the way the accused reacts to a given situation. It was not like a planned situation. Both parties seem to have been taken aback by it. And then his initial response, of course, tells it all, that despite all the difficulties that there are, and even though she had expressed that idea, she seems to have sometimes been feeling not being supported, and at the later stage she feels supported.
Yes, I mean, all I was saying is that seems to me to be as far as the WhatsApps go. There's no discernible point at which Mr. Shoba clearly expresses the wish, his wish, if he ever had it, for Ms. Pule to have the wish.
And if anything, she was supportive throughout. And at least all indications are that.
Yeah, well, we have an indication from Ms. Pule that she didn't think he was being particularly supportive.
Yes.
But that's about as bad as the WhatsApps get.
Yes, and also, despite that impression, she also, in some of the WhatsApp, also concedes that, just forgive me, sometimes I'm difficult, I'm sorry for my reaction. And it is understandable. I'm not an expert on relationships and or pregnancy, but going through a pregnancy, for that matter, must have been difficult for both, and it must have strained either party either way. But at the end of the day, it seems they were together into this and committed themselves to it, and even went in as far as going to look at the scans, and even joked about the head of the baby, and even gave the baby a name. Then now somebody wants to turn around and say in the background the accused was scheming to kill her. You cannot, with respect, ignore this overwhelming evidence indicative of the fact that Mr. Shoba could not have entertained killing the deceased based on the fact that he felt pressured by the
It
pregnancy.
certainly demonstrates that if he did, it was a deeply evil thing to do, and done notwithstanding the fact that he'd led Miss Pule to believe that he was interested in being a present father for the child. That's where it seems to go.
Yeah, and it does not go, and it's only a wind more than fact.
Mm. Can we just go back? I mean, you're asking me if there's anything I wanted you to address, and I do want to get back to what happened in those 3 minutes outside Mr. Shoba's complex. What I have at the moment is that it was 3 minutes. Mr. Shoba says it didn't feel like 3 minutes, but we can accept it was 3 minutes. We have the state's version.
What is the picture?
I'm sorry, are you looking for something?
I had the exhibit that His Lordship is.
Yeah.
Since I took mine back, I'll hand it to my friend again. May I approach?
Of course. Yes, I'm not sure I'm going to be making extensive references to the stills now, Mr. Makabila. I'm just trying to get a sense of what I have before me in relation to what happened during those 3 minutes. Mr. Shoba says it didn't feel like 3 minutes. The CCTV shows that it was 3 minutes.
Indeed, my lord.
We have, if we accept Mr. Malapani's evidence, we have the overwhelming likelihood that he was the person driving the car. Although I take what you say about the reliability of his evidence as a whole under advisement, and I'll give consideration to that. Then we have the only direct witness we have to what happened during those 3 minutes is Mr. Other than Mr. Malapani, of course, is Mr. Shoba himself. And he says that he heard a conversation between Ms. Pule and the driver of the vehicle, that he saw, I wrote the content of that conversation down, Ms. Pule, essence of it was Ms. Pule was telling the driver that he was sloshed, and that Mr. Shoba saw the driver of the vehicle, but he had a hat and a mask on. And for that reason, Mr. Shoba says he didn't know who it was. And that Mr. Shoba was standing to the left of the car, 7 or 8 meters behind it. The evidence also seemed to be that he saw the car pull up, and that's where he got a look at the driver's face that had a mask and on. That's where he saw the driver had a mask and a hat on. Is that what I have?
It would appear to be correct.
I'm just trying to establish what facts I have.
Yeah, these are the facts.
Mr. Malapani's account, of course, being that Mr. Shoba was actively encouraging Miss Pule to get into the car, even though she was reluctant to do so. And Mr. Shoba, Mr. Shoba clearly knowing who Mr. Malapani was, and them having communicated in some way, at least to the extent necessary to get Miss Pule to go into the car. That's Mr. Malapani's version.
Indeed, ma'am.
More or less. And those are the facts I have. Yes?
Those are the facts before his lordship.
Yeah. And there's nothing else.
For me to add on them, my lord.
There's nothing else that you're aware of on the conspectus of the evidence that's been presented that I should have regard to.
I cannot think of or perceive of any, and the activities around the gate, I seem to, yeah, that's all we have before.
Thank you.
And also the fact that picture 12, my lord, also, in as much as the a gate is open.
Oh, we're looking at picture 12 now.
Yes. At least on the highlighted picture to the right shows the deceased walking to the car.
Yes, there's no dispute that the shadow to her right is Mr. Shoba's shadow.
As it may please the court.
Which tends to show he was standing slightly behind the car to the left.
Indeed, ma'am. Consistent with his version.
At least at that point.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there anything else?
That's it, my lord.
Thank you.
Sorry, my lord, but I just approached.
Of course.
But I just approached.
Yes.
Just for a minute, it seems to be something longer that I need to digest. I'll ask for 3 minutes. Before I
What
close.
time is it? 25 past. Mr.
25 past.
It's 25 past 12. Mr. Mohammed, are you going to be very long?
No, my lord. I think I will be about 3 minutes, my lord.
Yeah.
2 points.
Yes. Very well. Then I'll come back at 25 to 1.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
All right.